أفلا يتدبرون القرآن ولو كان من عند غير الله لوجدوا فيه اختلافا كثيرا.
بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Just to briefly recap what we covered yesterday, and then we'll go straight into Surah Al-A'raf. So yesterday we covered Al-Fatiha all the way to the end of An'am, and we said that Surah Al-Baqarah, this is the point now which I'd actually get a lot of interaction from everyone, but because we're really short on time, I'll have to cut down a lot on the interaction, which is a big shame because it's really good to have the feedback of everyone. Surah Al-Fatiha is effectively the summary of the entire Qur'an. Every single aspect of Islam you can find under any of the ayats, the 7 ayats of Surah Al-Fatiha. After this, we have Surah Al-Baqarah, which is a surah which consists of 286 verses, and it can be divided into 4 parts: the introduction, a discussion related to the Bani Israel over history, over time, and also the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Then we find the discussion, which is the 3rd part, changes to the discussion related to the Sharia, and that's the reason why there's many rulings. There's over 15, 20 rulings at least in that section, and then there's a conclusion. And we said that the maqsad, or the aim of the purpose of that surah, Surah Al-Baqarah, is to prepare the ummah in how to receive the revelation and thereby spread it so that they can be an authority upon the earth. Then after this, we went over Surah Al-Imran, and we said Surah Al-Imran can be divided into 2 parts. The first part is from verse 1 to 119 effectively, and the second part is from 120 to 200. And the purpose of the surah is to explicate the different manners and ways that a person can stay steadfast upon the deen. And there's 2 main ways that a person can go astray, and that is through, the first thing is through shubuhat, and the second thing is through shahawat. As regards to shubuhat, then this is mentioned in the first part of the surah, in the incident of the people or the Christians of Najran coming to discuss certain things with the Messenger of Allah ﷺ. And regarding the issue related to shahawat desires, then this was under the title or under the incident that is explained in the latter part of the surah, and that is the Battle of Uhud. Then we went over Surah An-Nisa, and Surah An-Nisa is a surah which discusses adl and rahmah. So after we have the course, the methodology of how to implement the Sharia, and the importance of it has been explained in Surah Al-Baqarah, and how to stay firm upon that methodology in Surah Al-Imran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that once you have an authority on the earth, then do not neglect the weak people and those things which ordinarily people will be oppressing. So this would include, example, women, the orphans, the slaves, the concepts of dowry, inheritance. All of these things are mentioned in Surah An-Nisa. So there is the importance of justice and rahmah, of mercy, is overemphasized in the surah. Then we come to a conclusion in Surah Al-Ma'idah, which is the last surah from this series of surahs, which is from the Madani series, because Fatiha is Makki, Baqarah, Al-Imran, Nisa, Ma'idah, all of them are Madani surahs. And this is considered to be one of the last surahs to be revealed to the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the whole of this section, the surah, discusses the importance of fulfilling your promises and your contracts, honoring your contracts. So there are three main stories in this section. The 16 calls, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu. I made a mistake. I said that Surah Al-Ma'idah is the only surah which begins with Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu. That's actually incorrect. There are other surahs such as Surah Al-Mumtahina which begins with Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu as well. So please, if you noted that down, then just correct that, inshallah. There are 16 calls, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu in Surah Al-Ma'idah, and each of those calls refer to a particular topic. And there are three main stories mentioned in Surah Al-Ma'idah. The first one is when Musa alayhi salam ordered his people to go and fight in Jerusalem, and they breached that contract. They didn't honor their contract, and they decided to stay there, which consequently led to them wandering for 40 years in the area of Sinai. After this, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned another type of breach, and that is when one of the sons of Adam alayhi salam killed the other. So the story of Cain and Abel is here. And the final story, which is mentioned toward the end of the surah, is the incident by which this title of the surah is named after, and that is when the followers of Isa alayhi salam asked for a miracle, and then Isa alayhi salam told them that he will provide this miracle by the permission of Allah, but they are not allowed to disbelieve after that. And that was that the table would come from the heavens and they would eat from it. And they broke their contract, and they disbelieved in Isa alayhi salam and the religion of Allah. So now, and finally, and then the last surah that we went over yesterday was Surah An'am, which is a Makki surah, and this surah discusses the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Anyone wants to learn about Aqidah, then this is a surah to refer to. So many times Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about His qudra, His ability, and the things that He has done for us, and the universal signs that we see around us. And it has a formula. There's two words which appear in the surah throughout. The first one is huwa, and the second one is qul. And huwa is after anything that comes after the word huwa, generally speaking, it will discuss the power and the greatness of Allah Jalla wa Ala. And any thing that comes after the word qul, the command to convey, comes a command to convey the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, i.e. engage with the disbelievers regarding the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and give them da'wah. Now the story that is mentioned in Surah Al-An'am, which is also very suitable for this pattern that occurs throughout the surah, is when Ibrahim alayhi salam, he was challenging his people by giving an example, saying that look at the sun, look at the stars, look at all of these things, maybe they are our lords, but after each of those things had gone, that the sun would set, it would no longer be present and visible, he said this cannot be our God, and this is an example of how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he was giving an example of how he was demonstrating the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then to prove or engage and confront them and give da'wah to them. So this is where we've reached so far. So today, inshallah, we're going to be covering, hopefully, bi'idhnillah, Surah Al-A'raf up to the end of Surah Al-Kahf. So what we're going to do is that we're going to have 1 hour sessions, and in each session, inshallah, we'll try our best to cover 2 surahs at a time. So we're going to be looking at each of the surahs very briefly. And to be honest, the amount of these surahs, in reality, they cannot be explained properly in half an hour. So it's going to be a very brief sketch or an outline as to what these surahs are about, because they would at least need a minimum of an hour. But inshallah, we'll see how far we can get with this, inshallah. So Surah Al-A'raf. So I'm going to be speaking quite fast, so I need everyone to keep up, inshallah. Surah Al-A'raf is a Makki surah. Again, very uncharacteristic for a Makki surah to be this long. It consists of 206 verses, and it was revealed after the chapter of Sūrah. Now, this surah was revealed at a time where the confrontation between the Muslims and the disbelievers in Makkah was at its peak. And the Prophet ﷺ and the companions, prior to this, were ordered to call to Islam publicly, because there were 3 stages to the call in Makkah, and one of them, the final one, was to call publicly. And it is very natural that when someone is, or a group of people are engaging with society about those things which are quite sensitive, or those things which they strongly disagree with, then there would be some retaliation. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings this surah as a comfort to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as we will find in the very first ayah of the surah. And he mentions in this surah many examples of how this struggle between truth and falsehood began at the beginning of time. So in this surah, you'll find the struggle, the confrontation that took place between Adam and Iblis. Adam alayhi salam and Iblis. And after this, we'll see a discussion that takes place, a conversation that takes place between the people of Jannah and the people of Nar. And then we will see many prophets. I think there's 5 prophets. I'll have a look, we can maybe count it together. A number of prophets and how they called their people to Islam. So one of the goals, or one of the major goals of this chapter, is deciding whose side are you on. One of the main purposes of this surah is decisiveness, making a choice between which side you are on. So we find example, let's just go over some of the stories that were mentioned through the surah, and then we'll go to the beginning of the surah. So an example of whose side are you on, the story of Nuh alayhi salam is present in verse 64, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم فكذبوه فأنجيناه والذين معه في الفلك وأغرقنا الذين كذبوا بآياتنا إنهم كانوا قوما عمين. But they denied him, so we saved him, and those who were with him in the ship, and we drowned those who denied our sign. Indeed, they were a blind people. We find the people of Hud and the confrontation that Hud alayhi salam had with his people. And it's very similar in the wording. فَأَنْجَيْنَاهُ وَالَّذِينَ مَعَهُ بِرَحْمَةٍ مِنَّا وَقَطَّعْنَا دَابِرَ الَّذِينَ كَذَّبُوا بِآيَاتِنَا وَمَا كَانُوا مُؤْمِنِينَ. In verse 72, so we saved him and those with him by mercy from us. And we eliminated those who denied our signs, and they were not at all believers. So we find these verses one after the other, very similar in nature, mentioning example other prophets such as Lut and Shu'aib and Salih. So I think there are 5 prophets. So the 5 stories, the 5 prophets that are mentioned in the surah are Nuh, Lut, Shu'aib and Salih. These are 4 that are mentioned, and then Adam alayhi salam is also mentioned as well. Sorry? Oh, sorry, you're right, yes. So there's actually, from this section regarding the prophets calling their people, there's 5. There's Nuh, Hud, Lut, Shu'aib and Salih. Okay? I'll mention that again. Nuh, Hud, Lut, Shu'aib and Salih, alayhim salatu wasalam. So, let's start from the beginning. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He begins the surah by saying, كتاب أنزل إليك فلا يكن في صدرك حرج منه لتنذر به وذكرى للمؤمنين. So what did I say? That this surah came as a comfort to the Prophet ﷺ, because this was revealed at a time when the confrontation between the believers and the disbelievers in Makkah was at its peak. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to comfort the Prophet ﷺ through this surah to explain to him the number of nations before him, the number of ummahs and the prophets before him had to go through the very same thing that he is going through. And the second verse of this surah is, this is a book revealed to you. It begins with the huruf and the qata'at. This is a book revealed to you, so let there not be in your chest distress therefrom. Meaning that this is a book which is the truth, and don't think about the retaliation. Continue upon this path and do not worry about the blame of the blameless. Do not compromise your deen. Carry on with the struggle. This is the very same struggle that many of the prophets before you had gone through. And this is mentioned in the following verse, اتَّبِعُوا مَا أُنزِلَ إِلَيْكُم مِّن رَبِّكُمْ وَلَا تَتَّبِعُوا مِن دُونِهِ أَوْلِيَاءَ قَلِيلًا مَا تَذَكَّرُونَ. Follow what has been revealed to you from your Lord, and do not follow other than Him any allies. So there's a strict instruction to the believers, the Prophet ﷺ, to follow the truth and not to compromise. After this, from verse 19 to 20, we find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins the surah with the beginning of how this struggle began, and that was between Adam alayhi salam and Iblis. And from the tactics that Iblis used against Adam alayhi salam, but his weapon was that of nudity. For example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 20, فَوَسْوَسَ لَهُمَا الشَّيْطَانُ لِيُبْدِيَ لَهُمَا مَا وُرِيَ عَنْهُمَا مِنْ سَوْآتِهِمَا. But Satan whispered to them to make apparent to them that which was concealed from them of their private parts. So what was the result? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions this in verse 22, and when they tasted of the tree, their private parts became apparent to them. So as a result of the sin, then what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had covered for them had become apparent. This is the reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions after this matters related to clothing, like example, Ya Bani Adam khudhu zinatakum indi kulli masjid, as example in verse 31. So this was a tool that Satan used. We come further on, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about a discussion that takes place between the people of Jannah and the people of Nar. Or even before this, those types of people, the people of Jannah, people of Nar, on the day of resurrection. So example, he says, this is verse 44, وَنَادَ أَصْحَابُ الْجَنَّةِ أَصْحَابُ النَّارِ أَنْ قَدْ وَجَدْنَا مَا وَعَدَنَا رَبُّنَا حَقًّا فَهَلْ وَجَدْتُمْ مَا وَعَدَ رَبُّكُمْ حَقًّا قَالُوا نَعَمْ فَأَذَّنَ مُؤَذِّنٌ بَيْنَهُمْ اللَّعْنَةُ اللَّهِ عَلَى الظَّالِمِينَ. And the companions of paradise will call out to the companions of the fire, and they say, we have already found what our Lord promised us to be true. Have you found what your Lord promised to be true? They will say yes. Then an announcer will announce among them, the curse of Allah will be on the zalimun, the wrongdoers. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us about two homes. There is no third home. And I want you to remember this, because you have to remember why it's called Surah Al-A'raf, which we're going to come across very shortly. So there are two destinations. There's Jannah and there's Nar. There's no third destination. There's no purgatories, if I'm saying correctly, circle that they have in Christianity. A place between paradise and hellfire. But there is something, or in actual fact, just before we mention that, there is another powerful verse which continues, related to the discussion between the people of paradise and hellfire. وَنَادَى أَصْحَابُ النَّارِ أَصْحَابَ الْجَنَّةِ أَنْ أَفِيضُوا عَلَيْنَا مِنَ الْمَاءِ أَوْ مِمَّا رَزَقَكُمُ اللَّهُ قَالُوا إِنَّ اللَّهَ حَرَّمَهُمَا عَلَى الْكَافِرِينَ. And the companions of the fire would call to the companions of paradise, pour upon us some water, or from whatever Allah has provided you. They will say, indeed Allah has forbidden them both to the disbelievers. So this is an example of the conversation, how it carries on, and they are in a desperate situation, the people of hellfire, that they just want a little bit, just a drop of water from the people of paradise. Now, why is this surah called A'raf? And what is A'raf? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions this in verse 46. وَبَيْنَهُمَا حِجَابٌ. And between them is a partition. وَعَلَى الْأَعْرَافِ رِجَالٌ يَعْرِفُونَ كُلًّا بِسِيمَاهُمْ. And between them is a partition, and its elevations are men who recognize all of their marks. What is A'raf? A'raf is a place between paradise and hellfire. And it is very areas which are very high. And they can see people who are going into paradise, they can see people who are going into hellfire. But who are these people? These people are those who are neither of the people of paradise, nor are they the people of hellfire. And these are those whose good deeds are the same as the number of their bad deeds. Okay? So these are like the third party, but we will find out later what happens to them. Again, why are they being mentioned here? The reason why they're being mentioned here is as though Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, do not be like these people and be decisive in your decision. Make the right choice and do it quickly. Meaning, choose the party of paradise. After this, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the number of prophets who are calling their people to the truth. And what we notice between each of these stories is that there are three correlations, or three things that we can derive. Three things which occur in each of these stories. The first thing is that, or what we realize, or benefits that we can take from them, is firstly, that there is the struggle between truth and falsehood is eternal. So even from the time of Nuh alayhi salam, who was the first messenger, the first prophet was Adam alayhi salam, the first messenger was Nuh alayhi salam, that he was a messenger who was from the very early times of the history of this world. So even from his time until our time, this struggle has been going on, and it will go on until the day of judgment. The point is what is being emphasized is that this is not a new struggle. This has been going on for a long time, and it will carry on even after we die. The second thing that we learn from these stories of the prophets is that falsehood will be defeated. At the end, the believers will be successful, and falsehood will be defeated. The third thing is that the reason for defeat of falsehood is the lack of divine support. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not with these people. So here in this section, we come across 5 prophets. I've mentioned them already. Nuh, Hud, Lut, Salih, and Shu'aib, alayhim salam. And each of their messages are the same. Ya qawm i'budu Allah ma lakum min ilahin ghayruh. That oh my people, worship Allah, and do not worship other than Him. This was effectively the message that all of them called to. And this goes on for a substantial number of verses. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in verse 96, He comments. This is something which is very common in the Qur'an. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions a story, many a time He comments at the end. It's like, this is the moral of the story. And here is the moral of the story. وَلَوْ أَنَّ أَهْلَ الْقُرَىٰ آمَنُوا وَاتَّقَوْا لَفَتَحْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ بِبَرَكَاتٍ مِنَ السَّمَاءِ وَالْأَرْضِ. And if only the people of the cities had believed and feared Allah, we would have opened upon them blessings from the heavens and the earth. Sorry? Verse 96. Verse 96. Now I want you to think of an example. And this is a bit tough. I know this is a bit tough, but inshallah, if I were to give you the answer straight away, then you'd realize it. But it's also, I want to have a little bit of interaction. I want you to think of an example of a story that is in the, you know that's in the Qur'an, that would fit into this surah. Of a people, when the truth came to them, they were decisive and they followed it straight away, irrespective of the consequences that they may face. Can anyone think of an example of a story you know is in the Qur'an of a people who took decisive action, which fits into the surah, without looking into your notes or looking into the verses that come after this? Think of an example. Someone, when the truth came to them, they accepted it straight away. They took decisive action. Abu Bakr, yes, very true, but when he wasn't mentioned in the Qur'an, his conversion, Abu Bakr, his conversion, not mentioned in the Qur'an. Ashabul Kahf, how are Ashabul Kahf? No, okay, yeah, Ashabul Kahf, but it's not very clear that when the truth came to them, they believed it straight away. They did believe, for sure, definitely. Sorry? Ansar, okay, but where is that mentioned in the Qur'an? It has to be something you know is in the Qur'an, but you don't know what surah is in. An example. Yunus alayhi salam, no. Okay, this is what's mentioned straight after this. It is the magicians of Fir'aun. Yeah? Would you agree with this though? Do you see how this fits into the surah? This is the important thing. Try to relate the title and the objective of the surah along with the stories that Allah mentioned. Allah Jalla wa Ala mentioned. So this is what comes up after this. Now the story of Musa alayhi salam comes up in many surahs of the Qur'an. 29 surahs of the Qur'an. Many stories related to Musa alayhi salam comes in the Qur'an, and this is one of them. And each of the stories of Musa alayhi salam, they are mentioned for a particular reason, and this is one particular reason. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I'm sure you're quite well aware of the story of the magicians and Fir'aun, where Musa alayhi salam is constantly confronting, engaging Fir'aun. He's disbelieving, and then he said, then what is agreed is that they will both come together and there will be like a type of fight, not physical fight, but a fight of magic that will take place, where all of the people will come together, and this is the opportunity for Fir'aun, which he thinks is to deal with Musa alayhi salam, keep him quiet and humiliate him. But this plan was thrown into the Nile. It just did not happen. And so what happened is that Fir'aun, he brought his magicians, the best magicians, and he told them to do their magic, and they did their magic with which the people were quite impressed by. And then Musa alayhi salam, which was involved snakes and so on and so forth. Musa alayhi salam, he did his miracles. He did his miracles by the permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the snake that he had swallowed up all the other snakes of the magicians. Now what happened is that they were really surprised by this, and this is again a very good da'wah technique. If you were to go to the magicians and speak to them about certain things about Islam, maybe they wouldn't have believed. But this is something that they could relate to. And this is something, whenever we're giving da'wah, we should always speak to them at their level. And this is what Musa effectively did. He spoke to the magicians at their level. He did a type of so-called magic that these magicians, they were shocked by. They'd never seen anything like this in their life, because this is their livelihood. What they did is that they accepted Islam straight away. And this is the discussion that takes place. فَانْظُرْ كَيْفَ كَانَ عَاقِبَةُ الْمُفْسِدِينَ. So see how the end of the corruptors, this is verse 103. After this, in verse 104, وَقَالَ مُوسَى يَا فِرْعَوْنُ إِنِّي رَسُولٌ مِّن رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. And Moses said, O Pharaoh, I am the messenger from the Lord of the worlds. Now, after this happens and this confrontation takes place, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described how the truth had become manifest. فَوَقَعَ الْحَقُّ وَبَطَلَ مَا كَانُوا يَعْمَلُونَ. So the truth was established and abolished was what they were doing in verse 118. In verse 119, Allah says, and Pharaoh and his people were overcome right there and became debased. They became humiliated. وَأُلْقِيَ السَّحَرَةُ سَاجِدِينَ. What happened to the magicians? They prostrated. They said, قَالُوا آمَنَّا بِرَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. They said, we believe in the Lord of the world. SubhanAllah, imagine this. They don't even say, we believe in Allah. They say, we believe in the Lord of the world. What is so significant about this? Because Fir'aun thought he was the Lord of the world. And what do? They agitate him even more. And they say, Rabbi Musa wa Harun. They say, not only this, they agitate him even more. Not only do they say that we follow or we worship the Lord of the Alameen, the thing that you claim to be, not only this, but we also worship the very same Lord of Harun and Musa, your two enemies. So they're agitating, their decisive action was filled with Iman, their hearts were filled with Iman that they were able to confront the Fir'aun in this manner. What is the result of this? SubhanAllah. This is probably the worst way that a person can be killed. So he said, you believed in him before I gave you permission? Verse 123, 124. لَأَقْطِعَنَّ أَيْدِيَكُمْ وَأَرْجُلَكُمْ مِنْ خِلَافٍ ثُمَّ لَأُصَلِّبَنَّكُمْ أَجْمَعِينَ. That I will surely cut your hands and your feet on opposite sides. Then I will surely crucify you. Meaning that on one side, for instance, they will cut the right hand or the right arm and then cut the left leg. So this person will look completely deformed, and on top of that, they will be crucified. How did they react? SubhanAllah. How did they react? قَالُوا إِنَّا إِلَىٰ رَبِّنَا مُنْقَلِبُونَ. Indeed, we will return to our Lord. And then they make a dua, رَبَّنَا أَفْرِغْ عَلَيْنَا صَبْرًا وَتَوَفَّنَا مُسْلِمِينَ. Our Lord, pour on us patience and let us die as Muslims. So this is an example of decisive action that people in the past have taken. So imagine the seerah of the Prophet and imagine the people at the climax of the confrontation taking place between the believers and disbelievers. Imagine what comfort they would find in this surah, because they know that they will not be tortured in this moment. And this carried on, the corruption of Pharaoh carried on in verse 107. قَالَ سَنُقَتِّلُ أَبْنَاءَهُمْ وَنَسْتَحْيِي نِسَاءَهُمْ وَإِنَّا فَوْقَهُمْ قَاهِرُونَ. And Pharaoh said, we will kill their sons and keep their women alive, and indeed we are subjugated over them. So then the divine punishment of Pharaoh occurs gradually. In verse 133, we sent upon them the flood and the locusts and the lice and the frogs and the blood as distinct signs. In verse 136, so we took retribution from them, and we drowned them in the sea because they denied our signs and they were heedless of this. All of these things happen. Now here is an example of people who took decisive action. Now let's come and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does this often, where He gives us an example of people to follow. He gives us an example of people not to follow. And these are those such people. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قَالَ مُوسَى لِقَوْمِهِ اسْتَعِينُوا بِاللَّهِ وَاصْبِرُوا إِنَّ الْأَرْضَ لِلَّهِ يُورِثُهَا مَنْ يَشَاءُ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ وَالْعَاقِبَةُ لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. And Musa said to his people, seek help through Allah and be patient. Indeed, the earth belongs to Allah. He causes to inherit it whom He wills of His servants, and the best outcome is for the righteous. What was his people's response? قَالُوا أُوذِينَا مِنْ قَبْلِ أَنْ تَأْتِينَا وَمِنْ بَعْدِ مَا جِئْتَنَا. They said, we have been harmed before you came to us and after you have come to us. SubhanAllah, what a disgusting response. What a disgusting response. And this is really critical. This ayah is very critical. Because the companions, they're going through a hardship similar to the hardship of the Prophet ﷺ in the Makkah period. And they may think, anyone who's going through struggles, they may think, SubhanAllah, before you had all these problems, before you came, we had all these problems, and after you come, we have all these problems. This would be the response of some of the people, some of the Muslims in the times that we're living in. They may think, we're going through so many problems by being strict in our adherence to Islam. But why do we don't want to go through more problems? We're a minority in this country, so why do we want to go through more of these problems? But this is the wrong attitude. This is the wrong attitude, and this is the reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned their response to Musa alayhi salam. And what a thing to say to their prophet. That, we had problems before you came, and now we have more problems after you came. All you have done is harm us. SubhanAllah. Disgusting. And what does this lead to? This leads to, if they have this kind of attitude, this leads to them having a corrupt type of belief, right? So in verse 100 I have to actually read the verse. Verse 138 and what comes after it. They say, and we took the children of Israel across the sea, and they came upon people intent to devotion to some idol of theirs. So what did they say after seeing this sea split? They saw this miracle, this great miracle of the sea being split, of Pharaoh being drowned. What did they say to Musa alayhi salam after this? They said, "Oh Moses, make for us a God just as they have gods." قالوا يا موسى اجعل لنا إلها كما لهم آلهة. He said, indeed you are people behaving ignorantly. This is the type of people that Musa alayhi salam is dealing with. And then Musa alayhi salam, most of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's orders to the Bani Israel, it came in a forceful manner after this. For example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 1-5, take them with the determination and order your people to take the best of it. And the verses they follow in this manner. Now, after this, we come across a people who are from the same community, but they also lacked a type of decisiveness and determination. And they are a people that came after the time of Musa alayhi salam, and they are the people of Sabt, Ashab al-Sabt. This is mentioned in verse 163 to 157. What basically happened with the people of Saturday, of Sabt, as we know, is that from their time, their Sharia dictated that they should not do any work on Saturday. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tested these people, and He sent on those that day that they weren't allowed to work and do things. This is the reason why we find many Jews today not doing any work on Saturday. Because even the word sabt in the Arabic language means to cut, to cut off from doing any work. Allah tested them with many fish that came to them. They were living on the coast, and they realized that a lot of fish were coming on Saturday for some reason. So what they did, knowing that they're not allowed to work on Saturday, they left some nets on Friday night, and then on Sunday they collected all of the fish. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about these people, and what happened is those who refused to do this, they told those who did this that what you are doing is incorrect. What you are doing is incorrect. And trying to understand why this surah is mentioned, it's like people are struggling. People are trying to adhere. You can relate to this in our time as well. People are trying to follow orthodox Islam, the mainstream moderate Islam, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam have dictated to us. And then there are others who try to modernize it. They're trying to make it easier, because we have to change it to the times we're living in, and so on and so forth. So when they are criticized, they say that, you're making life more difficult for us. We are living in a new time, in a new era. This is the benefit that we can take from this story. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 165, and when they forgot that by which they had been reminded, we saved those who had forbidden evil and seized those who were wronged with a wretched punishment because they were defiantly disobeying. And there are a number of opinions as to those who kept quiet. Because there were not only two groups, those who did and those who didn't, but there was a third group. And those people were the ones who kept silent. They were on the fence. They didn't criticize those who did it, and they weren't with the people who did the criticizing. And there's a difference of opinion as to what happened to them, whether they were punished alongside those who did it. But as I said, there's a difference of opinion on the matter amongst the Mufassirin. And the whole same theme of decisiveness continues alongside the surah. But one of the things that makes someone indecisive is the disease of ghafla, of heedlessness. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned this toward the end of the surah in verse 172, where He said, lest you should say on the day of resurrection, indeed we were unaware, that we were ghafilin. And heedlessness is one of the most serious diseases that leads to hesitation. And the surah ends with a prostration. And this would remind us of what? From the surah? Sorry? Not Adam alayhi salam. There's another one. It's very true. Adam alayhi salam did, obviously, everyone prostrated to him. But there's something in the surah where people prostrated. The magician. This is the ultimate story with people who are decisive. They don't hesitate. They believe once the truth comes to them. They don't just believe in it begrudgingly, but they believe it wholeheartedly. So this is effectively Surah Baqarah. Now we're going to go on to Surah Anfāl after this, because as I said, we're going to try to cover two surahs in one session. Now Surah Anfāl is about what? I mentioned this very briefly. I mentioned one statement yesterday. Let's see if anyone can remember. Surah Anfāl is about what? And I did mention this. Battle of Badr. Excellent, Battle of Badr. When I mentioned that Al Imran mentions Battle of Uhud, I said that it came after Surah Anfāl. So this surah was revealed, or part of the surah was revealed before Surah Al Imran, because Uhud came after Badr. This surah is of course a Madani surah. It was a surah that was revealed after Baqarah, and it consists of 75 verses. And this surah, subhanAllah, even before discussing what the surah is about, let's just talk a little bit about anything that a person does. What is it what attribute or quality do they need? An Islamic quality that they need. For example, you may need sabr, you may need a number of things, but what is a very important thing that a person needs? Excellent, tawakkul, reliance in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But part of tawakkul is what? Part of having tawakkul, dependence, reliance on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is what? Sorry? Patience. Not patience. Connected, strongly connected to tawakkul. Can someone basically have tawakkul? Okay, I depend on Allah, and that's it. What else do they have to do? Not taqwa. Connected to tawakkul. Not iman. That's always connected to everything. Not common sense. Excellent. So you take steps. A person can't just say, oh yeah, I have tawakkul in Allah, and that's it. Ittikhadul asbab. They have to take the means to prove that they have tawakkul. They can't just have tawakkul and that's it. This is what the surah is talking about, effectively. Okay, this is what the surah is talking about. And we're going to discuss this in more detail. So, this was the day of separation. The Battle of Badr was the day of separation. Yeah. No, that's one of the things that features in the surah. One of the main things that features in the surah is tawakkul and the steps that one has to take in order for their tawakkul to be correct, which are the taking the means. We're going to discuss that in a bit more detail, inshallah. So this surah is about Badr, and this is the reason why some of the scholars called Surah Anfāl Surah al-Badr. Yeah, Surah al-Badr. And this was a day of separation. Why? Because it signified the strength of Islam. Prior to this, Islam was viewed as something which was weak. And after Badr, the success of Badr, it signified, it became a religion of strength. This is the reason, prior to Badr, there was no such thing as munafiqun. At the Battle of Badr, this is when the concept of nifaq came into society in force. Because if something is weak, why do you need hypocrites? Why do you need people who are pretending to be people who say that they are Muslims, but in actual fact they're not Muslims? Why do you need an enemy from within in a society that is weak aslan, right? So this was the sign that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had separated good from evil, and the strength of Islam was there. Now, this victory was not based purely on physical ability. We know this why? Because the people of Badr were only 313, around that number, and the enemies were 1,000. In actual fact, the number of horses that the Mushrikun had equaled the number of people that were on the side of the Muslims. There were around 300 horses that the Mushrikeen brought with them to the Battle of Badr. And they were very well equipped. The fighters with the Mushrikeen were very well equipped. Now, the chapter is called Anfāl, and it means the spoils of war, meaning the booty of war, the ghanima. This is what Anfāl means. And what is quite interesting, okay, so just before we discuss that, the surah, it can be divided into two parts. The first part of the surah is the belief that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the granter of winning. So in one word, how can you say that? When someone believes that Allah is the granter of ensuring victory for the believers, in one word, what would you describe that in? An Arabic term. Sorry? Rabbil Alameen is two words. One word. We mentioned it already. Tawakkul. To believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can bring you victory, this is basically tawakkul. Victory only comes from Allah. You have dependence in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that this is going to happen. The second part of Surah Anfāl talks about what? Ittikhadul asbab. Taking the means of this victory. Meaning that you take preparation physically and you are trying to reach your aim in the best of one's ability. Okay? So the surah can be divided into these two sections. So the surah begins with a question. يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْأَنفَالِ. They ask you, O Muhammad about the bounties, about the spoils of war. How does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala respond? He says, قُلِ الْأَنفَالُ لِلَّهِ وَالرَّسُولِ. Say that the decision related to the way that this is divided is with Allah and His Messenger. So is Allah really answering the question? Does He answer the question here? He doesn't. He's saying that this decision is with Allah. The companions, they asked this question, they said, how do we divide the booty? How do we divide the spoils of war? And this is not answered. And this is something that occurs a lot in the Qur'an. And it actually occurs a lot in the Arabic language. And this is the reason why the Orientalists, they do not understand the concept or the way, the style of the Arabic language. And this is not only in the Arabic language, but there is, this is also found in the Bible, is found in, in Semite languages. It's found in Semite languages. And someone who's actually discussed this in a very interesting manner is an Orientalist by the name of Michel Soupois. I think that's how you pronounce his name. He's a French Christian Orientalist, and he talks about this in some detail. You'll find that there's certain digressions that take place, but those digressions are there for a reason. Now, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does in the very first few verses of Anfāl is He doesn't answer the question of the companions. Rather, what He does is that He talks about the traits of true believers. So He says, فَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ وَأَصْلِحُوا ذَاتَ بَيْنَكُمْ وَأَطِيعُوا اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ إِن كُنتُم مُؤْمِنِينَ. That they are people who fear Allah and amend that which is between you, and they obey Allah and His Messenger if you should be of the believers. So many verses that come after this, or a number of verses that come after this, talk about the traits of the believers. They are not answering the question about the Anfāl. How does the spoils of war, how is it divided? Allah says in the second verse, إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ الَّذِينَ إِذَا ذُكِرَ اللَّهُ وَجِلَتْ قُلُوبُهُم. And the believers are those when Allah is mentioned, their hearts, they tremble, they become fearful of Him. These are some of the traits that are mentioned. When does Allah answer the question? When does Allah answer their question? The first ayah mentions the question. How do we divide the spoils of war? When does Allah mention this? Allah mentions this in verse 41. He says, وَاعْلَمُوا أَنَّمَا غَنِمْتُم مِّن شَيْءٍ فَإِنَّ لِلَّهِ خُمُسَهُ وَلِلرَّسُولِ وَلِذِي الْقُرْبَى وَالْيَتَامَى until the end of the verse. And know that anything you obtain from war booty, then indeed for Allah is 1/5 of it, and for the messenger, and for his near relatives, and the orphans. And He mentions a number of people how the spoil of war should be divided. So people may ask, why is it that the companions or the surah mentions a question, and that question is not answered until the 41st verse? There are a number of reasons for this. One of the reasons is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala delays the answer because He wants to slow down the worldly desires, and He wants to stress the victory of God. Like I said, the first part of the surah is about tawakkul. It's about believing that Allah is the one who can grant victory. With those things which are related to spoils of war is not answered until later on in the surah, in order to slow down the companions' desire for this Anfāl. And in actual fact, the initial response was what? قُلِ الْأَنفَالُ لِلَّهِ وَالرَّسُولِ. Say the decision concerning how the spoils of war is divided is left to the decision of Allah and His Messenger. So they are being told in this verse, first and foremost, this spoil, it doesn't belong to you, it belongs to Allah and His Messenger. So even in the 41st verse, when it's responded how it should be divided, this 5th is left for Allah and His Messenger, meaning that this is the first thing that is mentioned. Again, the stress away from the worldly things that you gain from victory, and the thing that should be emphasized is how to have this type of tawakkul. So let's talk about the first part of the chapter. The first part of the chapter, or the first element of the chapter, is knowing that victory only comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whenever you do anything, you have tawakkul, you have dependence on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And of course, it's not enough to have dependence. You need to also follow that up with doing those actions, and those are things which are mentioned in the second part of the surah. So, the first element, the first part of the having dependence, having tawakkul in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, meaning that this victory came from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How did Allah bring about this victory? He mentions in verse 5, it is just as when your Lord brought you out of your homes for the battle of Badr in truth, while indeed a party among the believers were unwilling. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that He is the one who planned this battle. He is the one who brought you out of your homes. He mentions as a second thing that he mentions of part of this tawakkul is that how he gave this victory, this divine victory that he gave, divine support that he gave to the believers. The second thing that is mentioned is that he helped them psychologically prepare for the battle. So, example, he mentioned in verse 11 how he gave them this drowsiness, or this very short type of sleep. In one of the hadith, one of the companions, he mentioned that he was one of the guards. He was one of the guards, and he noticed that he dozed off for a very short time. And when he woke up, he saw all of the companions around him asleep. Mu'az, the Prophet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them this very short sleep in order to prepare them for battle. And this is something that some of the mujahideen have actually mentioned in the jihads of this century, like in Afghanistan, when they were fighting against the Russians. They said that they also experienced this type of this sleep. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them a sleep, or a short drowsiness, sleep, that woke them up. And what happened after this? Then a little bit of rain came upon them, and they were able to make wudu, and they were able to pray to freshen them up. This was like a psychological preparation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them before the battle of Badr. The third thing, and the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted them victory, is that He helped them to have high morale, this high morale amongst the army. So he mentions it in verse 43 and 44. Remember, O Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when Allah showed them to you in your dream as few, and if He had shown them to you as many, you believers would have lost courage and would have disputed in the matter of whether to fight. But Allah saved you from that. Indeed, He is knowing of that which is within your chest. And remember, He showed them to you when you met them as few in your eyes, and He made you appear as few in their eyes. SubhanAllah. So imagine, you just try to part of that preparation of battle. You may think, okay, we are 300, they are 1,000, they are 3 times more than us. You would lose morale, you would lose hope. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made them, the 300, appear as many, and made the 1,000 look like few. And this is in verse 43 and 44. The fourth thing that Allah did in order to give them victory is that He sent upon them many angels. He could have sent them one, but how many does He send? In verse 9 He mentioned this. Remember when you asked help from your Lord, He answered you. Indeed, I will reinforce you with 1,000 from the angels, following one after the other. The fifth thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in terms of the ways that He gave victory to the believers at the Battle of Badr is He is the one who chose the place of battle, and He is the one who chose its time. He mentioned in verse 42. Remember when you were on the near side of the valley and they were on the farther side, and the caravan was lower in position than you. If you had made an appointment to meet, you would have missed the appointment. Meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose the place and chose the time because the particular place that He had chosen for the believers, it was dry and it was a little bit wet, and it would make the movement of the army easy, just to have a little bit of wetness. If they were on the other side or another part of the battle, another place of the battle, then that area was flooded. So Allah had inspired the Messenger of Allah and the believers to go to a certain place, and also at a particular time. The sixth point is that it is Allah who destroyed the people and not the believers. Allah mentioned in the very famous ayah in verse 17, and you did not kill them, but it was Allah who killed them. And you threw not when you threw, but it was Allah who threw. Because when the battalions were facing each other, two armies were facing each other, the Messenger of Allah threw dust, and they were a long way away from them. It wasn't like they were a few meters away. No, there was a distance between the two armies just before they were about to confront each other. The Prophet ﷺ, he picked up some dust, he threw it, and this dust reached the front line of their army. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is describing that and saying that it is not you who killed, but Allah is the one who killed. And it was, even though you threw, it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who threw this dust to the front line of the army. And because victory is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we must listen to the request, the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this is why He mentioned in verse 24, أيها الذين آمنوا استجيبوا لله وللرسول إذا دعاكم لما يحييكم. O you who have believed, respond to Allah and to the Messenger when He calls you to that which gives you life. We've mentioned those things that brought about the victory at the Battle of Badr, and this is through having tawakkul, those things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, depending on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the ways and manner in which He brought victory to the believers at Badr. But it is not enough for us to simply depend on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We have to show Him that this dependence is true. And the way that we do this is we take certain measures. So we can't just, when we're facing an exam, a test, we can't just say, okay, I'm going to have tawakkul in Allah, and Allah, because I am a believer and I have full tawakkul in Allah, Allah is the one who's going to make me pass these exams. No, we have to take the means. We have to revise. We need to make sure that we come to the exam early and make sure that we're there. It doesn't happen just like this. It's not enough just to make the dua. You have to take the steps. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions many of those steps in the second part of Sūrah Anfāl. The way that the believers, the first thing is preparing for the battle. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in verse 60, وَأَعِدُّوا لَهُمْ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُم مِّن قُوَّةٍ, and prepare against them whatever you are able. Very famous verse. That in order for you to bring this victory of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you have to prove yourself. You need to do your utmost best. He also said in verse 65 and 66 that, O Prophet, urge the believers to battle. If they are among you 20 who are steadfast, they will overcome 200. And if there are among you 100 who are steadfast, they will overcome 1,000. Here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that even though the angels are coming and they're going to help you, the 1,000 angels are coming to help you, it doesn't matter. You still have to do the work, you still have to battle, you still have to confront the enemies, and this is part of taking the steps. Another element of taking the steps, and you can say this is number 2 or number 3, is having the knowledge of the laws of war. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala indicates this in verse 56. And He says that if there are among you 100 who, that's the previous verse that I mentioned. So He indicates this in verse 56, and these verses show that one of the reasons for the defeat of the polytheists in the battle is of their lack of preparation. In actual fact, what they did is that they brought their marching band, they brought women with them, they got drunk, they were celebrating. All of this even before the battle even began. This is how confident the mushrikun of Quraysh were. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling them that the believers, they have to have a strategy. The fourth thing that is mentioned is having obedience to Allah and having brotherhood for His sake. And He mentioned this in verse 46. And obey Allah and His Messenger, and do not dispute and lose courage, then your strength will depart, and be patient. Indeed, Allah is with the patient. Unity is one of the important key factors in bringing about victory. The fifth thing that the believers are instructed to do in preparation for this battle, in doing those things which they are required to do as part of their tawakkul, is to abandon any type of deception and any type of arrogance. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, the translation of which is in verse 47, and do not be like those who came forth from their homes insolently and to be seen by people. You are not doing it for anyone other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And finally, He mentions in verse 6 the traits that are required of the believers in being proactive, in being positive, and in being practical. And these traits are mentioned throughout the surah. In the beginning of Surah Anfāl and towards the end of Surah Anfāl, He mentions certain traits. And after mentioning these certain traits, as I mentioned, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions this Anfāl, rather than answering how this spoils of war should be divided, He mentions the traits of the believers. Remember I said this. After these verses of how the traits of believers are mentioned, what does He say? He says in verse 4, أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ حَقًّا, that they are the believers in the true sense of the word. They are the true believers, those who have those traits. What is interesting is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions another set of traits of the believers towards the end of the surah. And after mentioning those traits towards the end of the surah, then He also mentions in verse 74, أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ حَقًّا, the very same thing, sentence, statement that He mentioned in the beginning. As I've said over and over again, that there is a relationship between the beginning of the surah and the end of the surah. You'll find those things which are mentioned in the beginning of the surah to be very similar to that which is at the end of the surah. But there is a difference between the connotation of these words. أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ حَقًّا, the one which is found in verse 4, and the one which is found in verse 74. They are the traits which are similar for those things, for having tawakkul, and those things which are similar to those who bring about these means. So someone may ask, why is it called Surah Anfāl? Why is it called the spoils of war? Because the spoils, they represent the luxuries of this life. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't want the believers to be obsessed or to have a close attachment to these things. This is the reason why in the very beginning of the surah, when this question is asked, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't answer it until the 41st verse. So in an actual fact, these are the things that ruin brotherhood and ruin victory by only thinking about these spoils of war. And this is a warning from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not to fight over worldly gains, because these are the things that bring about defeats in an army, and these are the things that divide the believers. So don't worry about these spoils of war. If you get it, it's a bonus. This is the attitude that the believers should have. After this, the surah ends with inheritance, because the result of battle is death. And what used to occur is that between the brothers of creed, meaning that a brother is a brother due to their Islam, they were able to inherit from each other in the early part of Islam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the latter part of the surah, in verse 75 and around those verses, He repeals this law. He abrogates this concept. And He said that inheritance can only occur amongst blood relatives. And this is how the surah ends. And inshallah, we'll end this session with any questions that you have. And then after this, we'll go over Surah At-Tawbah and Surah Yunus in the next session. So are there any questions related to the two surahs that we've got? Sisters, if you have any questions, please write it down. And then if you can leave it near the stairs, just outside your rooms, and then inshallah one of the brothers will collect it, and I'll try to answer it in the beginning of the next session.
Maybe you said that the people of the world are people whose
yeah, the people of Arab, yeah.
You know, they call like the girls, okay? And they are like praiseworthy light. So it doesn't seem the people who are very simple.
You said you mentioned what happened to them.
Yeah, so did I not mention what happened to them? Okay, so what will happen to the people of Arab is they are described as people whose good deeds are equal to their bad deeds. So they will be on these heights between Jannah and Nar, and they will see the people of Nar enter Nar, they will see the people of Jannah enter Jannah, and what will end up happening to them is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will forgive them, and they will go to paradise. This is the end result. So they're not necessarily, I didn't paint them in a negative light, but the point is that no one wants to be in that situation. The importance of decisiveness is mentioned in Surah Al-A'raf as a result of them not being clear about which group they wanted to be in. Whether they were mentioned in a good light or in a bad light, that's not important. The important thing is that we have to choose which side are we on, and we don't want to be in that situation. That's basically the reason why the surah has been mentioned after that, about making a decision, being decisive.
Is that prison life right now?
Sorry?
Maybe like from this right now, that present life, like we live in the morning.
Absolutely. It's very important. It's very important that we look at any of the ayahs of the Qur'an that are related to our times. It's really good and interesting to relate it to the seerah of the Prophet. I don't think this is done enough, but also it should be related to how we can make it practical, how we actually do it. Even when the disbelievers are mentioned, then we shouldn't think that these are verses related to disbelievers. It doesn't really relate to me. No, it does relate to us, because we can still take the benefit, a lesson from that as well.
Sorry, if they were in their scholars, that Allah wants to show them that this struggle you were involved in, this struggle you were involved in this dunya, this was the result of people who followed you, and this was the end of those who opposed you. So could it be that they
okay, I see what you mean. I don't know. I haven't read this. Okay. So if you come across it, let me know. Let me know where you read it. Okay, so we'll stop here. We'll take a 10-minute break, and then we'll resume.